Well, good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Today's program is focused on The Power of Bad, a book by John Tierney and Roy Baumeister. Previously, this duo teamed up to write the New York Times best-selling Willpower. And let me tell you a little bit about our guests. Roy Baumeister has taught all around the world and is joining us today from Utah. It's not too much to say that his academic research in the field of psychology has genuinely shaped the discipline. With more than 500 articles and 30 books, he's received numerous awards, including the prestigious William James Fallow Award for Lifetime Achievement. And John Tierney is a familiar presence in the American media scene. He's written on science and human behavior for dozens of publications, teamed up with satirist Christopher Buckley on a novel, and was a familiar face at several high-profile positions with the New York Times for more than 2 decades. His work is often found on the pages of City Journal. In 2014, John was awarded CEI's highest honor, the Julian L. Simon Memorial Award. Now, like other online programs CEI has hosted in the past couple of months, we want to include our audience in the conversation. If you have a question for Roy or John, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the screen. Or, as an alternate, you can send an email to events@cei.org. John and Roy, I'd love to simply sit and chat and catch up. It seems like years ago, but it was only February when I saw you in New York. So today, let's set that aside and dive in, because I know everyone is not interested in our chit chat. I want to start with your book. It's a book I found both deeply insightful and perfectly suited to our times. So to get us rolling, perhaps you could each take a few minutes. We'll start with Roy and then turn to John, and tell us about the book. What is it you most want people to take away from The Power of Bad?
All right. Well, for me, I think the exciting key point was that this is a newly discovered property of the human mind, and this is a basic, and it's hard to come by a new insight into how the mind works. And we stumbled on it by accident. I started noticing in reviewing research when I was working on other projects that in many studies, if there was a good and a bad manipulation, the bad seemed to have a stronger effect than the good one. So people had noticed it in a couple areas, and then I thought, well, nobody's put it together though for the big picture. So I summoned a bunch of my younger colleagues and said, let's review all the research we could find in the field and find out when this is true and when it isn't. And then we can understand the exceptions that will tell us what is responsible for what causes it. Only we could not really find exceptions. And so even though we're a little bit frustrated there that the effects of bad things was always stronger than the effects of good things, it had the excitement that this is so universal and such a fundamental property that the mind tends to react to negative things, to bad things, to dangers, to threats much more strongly than to good things. So I would start there.
And you talk about this in terms of hardwiring, right? This is an adaptive technique for the species.
There's even a little bit of evidence for this kind of greater reaction in rats. And psychologists spent the first half century doing their experiments on rats. And rats will respond more strongly to punishment than to reward. And they will learn faster, resist forgetting better, and change their motivation more strongly to avoid a bad thing than to approach a good thing. So that suggests, yes, it's very old in evolution. And that's kind of what we came around to, that this is an evolved property of the mind. When we think of things like food, it's more important to avoid poison, things that will kill you, than to find something good. So, for example, if you have 4 meals of fish and 2 of them are delicious and sublime and make you really happy, and 2 of them make you sick to your stomach and you're up all night vomiting, well, that's 2 apiece. Is that a tie? No, it's not. You're not going to eat fish anymore for a long time after that. And so in exploring the world, we needed to avoid predators. I mean, one thing we say in the book, life has to win every day. Death only has to win once. So job one is to avoid dying and avoid other disasters. So that's, I think, why the mind evolved to just react and indeed overreact to bad things.
Now, John, you came at this from a different angle in the sense of these questions, in that unlike the experiments in the academy and trying to understand in a controlled environment, you were out there reporting on the way people really behave and how they react to situations. Do you have a similar or a slightly different perspective on what's most important about the book?
Similar, but Roy and I share a lot of things. First, I want to thank you very much for for inviting us. I have been such a fan of CEI over the years. That Julian Simon leaf, that marijuana leaf, that trophy is really occupies the top place in my shelf. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. I've been interested in this topic my whole journalistic career from the very beginning, because I just kept noticing how journalists hype crises, how every story turns into a bad news story. We always hype things. And I kind of wondered why we did this. I wondered why people wanted to read it. Why was there an audience for so much doom and gloom? And I didn't really get the answer until I saw Roy's paper, Bad is Stronger Than Good, a great title for a paper. And so we wanted to, to share this message with people, to let people understand it. And what we're hoping readers will take away from this is we want them to understand the power of bad so they can harness it when it's useful and overcome it when it's not. That it just applies to so many things in life. It applies to, how couples get along, how children, learn, how businesses succeed, how religions grow. It explains everything from, why countries go to war to why football coaches punt too often. And, understanding it's an irrational part of our brain. It is hardwired in, as you say, but we can also use our rational brain to override it and to learn from it. I guess the biggest takeaway that I hope from this book is that people will see the world more accurately and more optimistically. That just about every measure of human welfare is improving, but we don't see that. I mean, that's true even in this grim time today, but we don't see it because we're just bombarded all day by messages from what we call the merchants of bad. That's the marketers, the journalists, like myself, politicians, who exploit this negativity bias and use it for their own purposes. Now, obviously, as I say, there are real problems in the world. This pandemic is one of them. But we are still the luckiest people, and we'd be better off if more people understood, just how good we have it and how we can make it better.
I want to underscore something you said there, because I think it's vitally important, and I'll probably say it several times through the hour that you're able to join us today. The headline, the blockbuster that you have, is about the power of bad, about this overwhelming force or hardwiring, but there's a really important element of the subtitle, which is there are strategies. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. There are ways to overcome this, as you say, to use it to our own advantage. And that leads me to my first question. If everyone has this propensity to focus on risk aversion, to try to avoid pain, and to really focus in on bad outcomes, as opposed to look for the silver linings and to move toward good outcomes, yet progress happens, as you just stated. The world is getting better. Crime goes down. Health goes up. Health outcomes are improving across the world, not just in advanced or developed economies. Is it the case that everyone has available to them these strategies? It would seem to me that if progress continues, yet it is human nature to have this hard wiring, that it is universally available that we can succeed in spite of the power of bad. It's not a special superpower. It's not something unique to people of certain place or time, that it too, the good, might be universal. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I'm not sure exactly how to respond. The power of bad. I mean, we have a basically optimistic book. Just understand the power of bad is a trick of the mind. So it's a tendency that probably served our ancestors very well in evolution, to watch out for bad things and improve bad things. But it does sort of blind us to the good. I like the point John raised a couple of minutes ago. One of the paradoxes of living in America these days is that so many things are so much better than they ever were before, and yet so many people are walking around thinking, oh, there's going to be a disaster and everything is falling apart and it's terrible. But no, really, the progress continues unabated. Even just to go back and live 50 or 100 years ago would be a shocking deprivation, compared to all the things we enjoy today.
It's also, I think, that this power of bad, I mean, it's a very useful force in causing us to do better and causing society to progress. I mean, bad things, mistakes are how we learn, and it's the quickest way. It's much more powerful to learn from a mistake, and we see problems and they motivate us to come up with solutions. That's what happens. One of the things we talk about in the book is how schools are not doing very well today, unlike a lot of other institutions, because we've gone away from penalties. So everybody gets a trophy philosophy, and people learn more from that. But people have, as you say, people do have these inner tools to do it. There's something called the Pollyanna principle, which is that although there are a lot more words for bad things than for good things, because we care more about them, and we tend to use the good words more often, and we have these mental tricks. In fact, people for accentuating the positive, so that older people, for instance, tend to be happier than younger people because they're not so affected by negativity bias. They focus more on the good things in life, on the good moments. They use, they're grateful for what they have. They don't obsess about failures as much as younger people do. And so you see, even though they have worse physical problems, they're actually happier. And we've got a chapter talking about these glad games. We draw from the Pollyanna principle is named after this sort of nauseatingly optimistic character in a novel and movies. And she's always been hated by critics with good reason. They're pretty awful books, but her basic strategies are really good. I mean, this thing to find something, to look for the positive and overcome your negativity bias. There's also an interesting thing where people have a negativity bias when we look at the world. We see the worst. And we walk into a room and we see a group of faces and we focus immediately on the hostile one and ignore all the smiles. When someone gives us an evaluation, we ignore the praise and focus on that one bit of criticism, that we're getting. And of course, in the news, we just see the worst stuff, the worst thing happening anywhere in the world that they could find today. But people also have this inner optimism bias, and that we think things are going badly out there. We think bad things are going to happen, but we often don't think they're going to happen to us. And that's why you have this optimism, of entrepreneurs who might think, yeah, most businesses fail, but mine is going to succeed. And that really is how humanity progresses. It's that optimism that, that you can succeed on your own, and you're going to keep trying it. And of course, the failures that we make along the way, that society makes, that we make individually, we learn from those things to become better. That's really where the power of bad is great, at teaching you what's wrong and teaching you how to improve.
Can we keep with that comment there about what we see in the news and the media? And in particular, you have a discussion in the book about digital media and how information spreads and the effects of the power of bad and negativity bias vis-a-vis digital media. Could you unpack that for people a little bit?
Sure. When I started writing the book, I was thinking of digital media, social media. I'd heard the usual things about Instagram envy and Facebook depression, and I thought that was another example of the power of bad, ruining things for us. But when I looked into it, I found that this was kind of another sort of manufactured crisis by the media, and that although sure there's a lot of negative stuff on social media, you get these Twitter wars, you get these cancel culture, that kind of stuff goes on, but it's not the typical thing that happens on social media. And the good news about social media is that it's actually more positive than mass media. And that's because mass media, the easiest way to get a mass audience, we all fear the same things. We all fear death. We all fear illness. So the easiest way to get a mass audience is to focus on the bad and bring out the bad news. But in social media, people tend to share, on the whole, positive things much more than the mass media does. In fact, on Twitter and Facebook, you actually get more followers, more response by posting positive things. You know, those tweets tend to spread more widely. You know, people don't share on Facebook pictures of school ground shootings, you know, or terrorist attacks. They tend to share more positive things. And so we think that social media, offers some hope, because people can actually get more positive things instead of this negativity stuff for mass consumption. And we advocate what we call a low bad diet, which is to curate your news feed so you're seeing a more accurate picture of the world instead of that that doom and gloom that you get from the mass media.
And Roy, how has this played out? There is a nice discussion of the science with. You went looking to understand this. You went looking across all sorts of disciplines. You've co-authored with not just psychologists like yourself, but people in other disciplines and other fields. We've had mention of parenting. We've had mention of the workplace, sports. Where is it that, is there anywhere that the power of bad doesn't show up? And where is it that you were most surprised to find this sort of research?
Well, we set out, we had various pet theories that my co-authors and I on the scientific paper as to when good would be more potent. For example, we thought, well, maybe bad predominates when thinking about the past, but good would predominate when you're thinking about the future, because you have to be hopeful and optimistic. But none of that turned out. That if there's a possibility of something bad happening in the future, that has a stronger effect. Indeed, one of the places where a local version of this had been seen before was in economics, what they call loss aversion, that often investors are just rational, but when they're not rational, they err on the side of reducing losses. They're more afraid of losing money than they're eager to gain money. And in the same in reactions, when it actually happens, you're more upset about losing $100 than you're happy about gaining $100. Both effects are real, but the negative one is stronger. So that had been one that found it, and I guess just what astonished me in the original reviewing the scientific literature was just so many places it occurred over and over again. I mean, you have a good day, you have a bad day, you feel bad, but the bad day carries over the next day, whereas after a good day, you start over the next day. And there's a very rigorous data from following people and asking them, how do you feel right now, day after day, and so on. So the bad effect has a longer lasting one. I think John mentioned people learn faster from punishment than from reward, and sort of nicely designed studies where every time the child got an answer right, they would give them a marble, and we could put in a jar, and it was your marble. Or you started with a full jar of marbles, and every time you got one wrong, they took one away, and the kids learned faster when they were losing marbles. There's even a study with teachers on the same thing. They offered a bonus if a certain percentage of the class met the achievement goals at the achievement test at the end of the year. So some of the teachers, the bonus was there as a reward in the future. The others, they gave the teachers the bonus at the beginning of the year and said, well, if your kids don't make it, you'll have to pay it back. So it's the same money, the same thing. But those kids did better when the teachers had the money up front and were afraid of losing it. So again, somehow a change in the teacher's behavior led to a change in how the students performed on an objective test. And the motivating thing was the fear in the future of something bad rather than the promise of something good. And so, like I said, we found this over and over again in relationships. I ask my students, why should someone marry you? What would make you a good partner or spouse? And they bring up all sorts of positive things. I'm a good listener, I make money, I have a sense of humor, I'm good in bed, blah, blah, blah. But really what the data show is it's the negative things that have more impact on a relationship. So if you can hold your tongue and not say something mean, even when you're upset, that's going to do more for the relationship than telling jokes and being charming or a good listener or all those positive things. And in particular,
so it's almost like a Hippocratic oath for life.
yes, first do no harm, and that's how you can have the biggest improvement too. Psychology recently has this positive psychology movement, but it's in recognition that the first thing was to deal with people who are suffering with mental illness and try to bring them sort of from a negative number up to zero. And so, yes, that was the priority, and that's what they studied first. And only then did the positive psychologists come along and say, well, getting people to zero, that's not the end of our job. If we can make people who are already fine, but make them even better and happier and more likely to flourish, that's good too. But that's the second thing. The first way to have an impact on individuals, on society, on your company or whatever, eliminate the bad.
Now, I notice so many of the examples mirror our everyday activities in life in the following way. They deal with groups of people, oftentimes small groups, a partner, family, a household, a classroom, a sports team. The strategies that you have, thinking slow, using reason, putting things in context, do these strategies work principally at the individual level, or do they also work among groups of people? Are there strategies for a small group of people to improve their ability to deal with negativity bias?
Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, groups, everything that happens in groups happens through individuals, but by virtue of what they share and how they work together, you can make a difference. So John found this stuff on work teams. Eliminating the one bad person. There's some writer who called it the no asshole rule. That you want to make sure, because one bad person can really spoil the whole culture, the whole attitudes of the group. If you have a seriously dysfunctional group, putting one good person in there is not going to save it. But if you have a good, thriving group, putting one bad person in there can really mess it up. So at the group level, if you're putting together a group, be on your lookout for that. It's not so much maximizing the good, but the first thing is to minimize the bad. Does that address your question?
Yeah, yes, and I want to ask John if you could take that even one step further. John Tierney, you've recently written about Professor Higgs and the effects of negativity on the body politic and the way we understand government and crisis, the way we understand these crises of crises, which I want to come back to. But how does this work on a society-wide level when we're dealing with government agencies and political leaders?
Well, I mean, it's very tough because the easiest way to get ahead in politics, as in journalism, is to scare people and to focus on the negative. And that's when, Bob Higgs, as you know, this great economist who looked back at the history of government growth over the last century and saw that it tends to, increase only slowly most of the time. But when there's a crisis, real or imagined, if there's a war, financial panic, something else, that's when government suddenly ratchets up. And spending goes up, regulations go up, and and in the book we talk about how this leads to demosclerosis, which is another great economist, Mansur Olson, concept he showed that what really brings down societies, it isn't one terrible thing, it's the gradual hardening of the clogging of the economic arteries by these more and more regulations and favors to special interests. It just sort of tends to slow societies down. And we saw this in the pandemic here. One of the reasons that the CDC and the FDA were so terrible in their initial response is that there was all this harmful red tape that, that had built up. And this was, largely in response to previous crises. If something goes wrong and we're going to pass 10 rules to deal with it. And what happens is it slows you down and makes you less able to react to the next one. And we see that over and over again. And it's something that I fear in this one, that, that we're going to add a lot more layers of bureaucracy and things that will make us less able to deal with the next crisis. So,
well, not if I have anything to do with it, John.
Keep CEI fighting. Keep CEI fighting.
I want to bring in the first of our questions from the audience. Picking up on, you've mentioned several times the way the media has internalized the lesson, if it bleeds, it leads, and that will sell newspapers on a mass scale, as well as other media. What strategies exist? What is the best way to offer news and material about exciting, positive things? Not just good news like statistics about human welfare improving, but this morning, I saw two different stories. One was about something the president said that was negative about social media and censorship. And on the other hand, I saw a story about astronauts going into space today. And I can tell you that my media diet, my own personal media diet, has been dominated by the former, not by the latter. And the latter is a really interesting development in technology and space and exploration. So what is a good strategy for promoting these good news stories and these interesting, positive things?
Well, people have tried to do, good news sites and positive news sites, and these things, do get something of a following. But I think, the problem is that it's hard for a mass, market to do that. And I think the main thing is to follow people who are positive. I follow people who love space and who send that. I'm fascinated by that. By the launch that's coming up today, we hope. And there are people that really follow that. And it's a great thing about social media that, you've got all these different groups, because the positive things in our lives, the things that about human progress, and the positive things like, advances in science and culture and technology and understanding of history, these tend to be niche markets. They're not mass markets. There's Civil War buffs. There are people who are interested in particle physics. But the great thing about social media is those people find each other and they share the information and they follow that. And I think spend more time following that kind of thing than looking at the latest, war in Washington between, the latest Twitter war between Trump and someone else. I mean, it takes some discipline to do that. But when there's a school shooting or a terrorist attack, I just turn off the news. I want to know what happened. That takes about one sentence, and then I just avoid it and don't wallow in that stuff. And I think those of us in journalism and in Washington and in this political fight, it's kind of our job to follow these fights and to get involved in them. But for most people, I think if you're not getting paid to do it, you don't have to follow these pundits fighting with each other and these politicians fighting. There's so many good things going on in the world. And we talk about the rule of 4 in our book, was that in general, it's a rough gauge that it takes 4 good things to overcome 1 bad thing. And, try to follow that in the news you consume. Try to find 4 positive things for every, negative story. That'll give you a much more accurate view of the world, because there's a lot more than 4 good things happening for every bad
thing. The next question I have, again from the audience, comes from Nathan, and it's I think it's, again, the practical application of these ideas, something that you've both written about. John, I think you've covered extensively, and it brings us back again to this idea that you discussed throughout the book. The genuine crisis that we have is a crisis of crises, right? Mm-hmm. Everything seems, whether it's child abduction or fatty foods or the next meteor to come to America or the Earth, everything is a crisis, which makes it seem as if maybe we can't handle any of it. And the question from our audience is about the green movement. And how do we understand, how do we explain the dramatic improvements in environmental quality and public health in the last 50 years, and yet the green movement has developed such traction with bad news stories? How is it that the facts suggest we're all better off, the water's cleaner, the air's cleaner, more people are living healthy lives, and yet everything's hell in a handbasket if you listen to major environmental organizations?
Well, the 3 assumptions that I suggest everyone should make when you're contemplating some environmental crisis, are really any bit of news, which is, these are the assumptions of the crisis as we call it, which is that the world will always seem to be in crisis. Number 2, the crisis is never as bad as it seems. And number 3, is that the solution could easily make things worse. And so, I mean, part of our effort here is, I mean, it's hard to get people not to pay attention to bad news, and we're not pretending that we can eliminate this bias, but we do think people do have the rational capacity. If they start stepping back and looking at this and questioning some of these assumptions, they can individually overcome some of this bias. And then, on a social level, we talk about various, solutions for the crisis, very institutional solutions you can have, and they're difficult because the incentives all go the other way in mass media and in politics. That there's such an incentive the other way. I mean, one solution I could talk about, and that's relevant to this pandemic, is that it's what's called a red team exercise, and that is, and this has been used at the Pentagon and in private companies and some other places. And it's when somebody has a new, identifies some supposed crisis and develops a solution for it, like an environmental, problem. Before you, rush into doing something rash about this, you can have one team that's called the blue team that comes up with a plan to deal with this supposed problem. And then you bring in another team, it's called the red team, and their job is to look at it skeptically. They're supposed to look for the holes in the argument, to look at the big picture, to look at those, Ken, you mentioned all these great environmental trends. When someone says we've got to spend $1 trillion to deal with some environmental problem, someone should look at what's the long-term trend when it comes to air quality, when it comes to this. What's the big picture, and what are the, instead of looking at doomsday scenarios. I mean, that's what got us in trouble, in the COVID crisis here, that we, politicians in the UK and in the United States were guided by these worst case, scenarios, these worst case projections that turned out to be just wildly off when it came to how deadly the virus was, when it came to how many people were going to die, when it came to how many hospital beds were going to be used. Now, it's understandable that politicians react to that. They've got, they don't want to be blamed for anything. They know all about the negativity effect, but we need some countervailing force. And for instance, what I would have done, when Fauci and Redfield from the CDC, came in with these warnings that the virus is going to, is going to be so catastrophic, I would have brought in another team of skeptics to look at them. And also, I mean, both Fauci and Redfield and these guys have pretty bad track records when it comes to previous predictions. They have predicted, apocalypses, before from viruses that turned out not to be true. So you want to get, and some sort of institutionalized skepticism, people who will come in and actually subject this to, and trying to get what's the best guess, not what's the worst case scenario. So that's, that's at an institutional level. And at the personal level, I think you've got to just try to be very skeptical of any crisis in the news and try to get a long-term perspective on something instead of, journalists, the old saying in journalism is the three anecdotes make a trend. And what you need to do, and Julian Simon, it was so great, the Julian Simon Award at CEI, what he showed was during the environmental crises of the 70s and 80s, when there were all these predictions that we're running out of energy, that the population boom, we're all going to starve to death, he looked back at history and he saw what the long-term trend was. And one of his solutions is one that we also suggest in the book, which is when an environmentalist or anyone else makes a doomsday scenario and says we have to spend a lot of money to solve this, you should ask them to make a testable prediction and bet on it. That was Julian Simon's approach, and he very greatly embarrassed John Holdren, who became Obama's science advisor, and Paul Ehrlich by forcing them to bet on when they said the world's running out of resources, he forced them to bet, and they were wrong. And I think that's another thing I wish more journalists would do. I wish more people would insist on profits making testable predictions and putting their own money on it, not just relying on these doomsday scenarios.
Does it fit with that, Roy? Do we discount or not take into account enough the ability to learn and adapt? It seems that not only are we attracted to the negative, but we don't include in our theories of the way the world is working and these longer term trends that John is describing, that people can learn, societies can improve, and we can develop new technologies or new ways of doing things to solve problems that crop up.
Well, that is probably something that the merchants of bad will tend to do. They'll just extrapolate. If this goes on like it will, things will get worse and worse, and there'll be a disaster. And yet, in reality, things turn out. When they start to get bad, then people turn around and adjust to them. The environmental movement you brought up, that's been a good example. And they've been predicting imminent disaster based on extrapolating from trends. I remember the 60s and 70s. It started with there's going to be a silent spring. There won't be any birds anymore. Incidentally, I hear the birds singing behind you. Clearly, we didn't run out of birds. And we made some adjustments, and the pollution was going to get so bad that we wouldn't be able to see across the room or something like that. And yet, as you mentioned, there's been responses that air quality and water quality are improving. So, to some extent, the environmental movement has lost credibility by making these constant doomsday predictions that don't really recognize the capacity for individuals and for organizations to learn, to adjust, to make things better.
Have you found, again, I just want to draw in some insight from our audience here. Have you found different reactions to your book and this thesis and all the myriad examples you have from different types of audiences, younger versus older? John, you mentioned, I think it was John that you mentioned earlier, the effect of contentedness and happiness as people age. More scientific audiences, more general audiences. Are there different reactions to this thesis, or is it pretty universal across the board?
I've not noticed a lot of different audience reactions. I know when I first published the review article, the scientific community didn't react all that much, except over the years it's become one of the most heavily cited papers in psychology. What the way scientists are evaluated, they look as if you publish something, is it ever mentioned in someone else's bibliography? Does it show up there? And Google Scholar says if you can get to 10, that's a success on that publication. So most things have 0, and so getting to 10 is pretty good. And this one has been listed in something like 7,000 other scientific publications. So there is an embrace, and it's possible to get listed a lot if people are criticizing or attacking it, but no, there's not much of that. Mostly they're saying, well, we found it in this project too, and we found it here too, and here. So over and over again, it continues to show up. I know when we started doing research for the book, I looked through hundreds of papers that had mentioned ours, wanting to know, is somebody found significant exceptions? Are there criticisms? Are there things I should know about? But no, mostly people were building on it. There were some clever ideas. There's some recent work that in many things you have to hit the middle, find the middle range is good. And so there's one way of being right and 2 ways of being wrong. You can have too much or not enough. So that's sort of an interesting refinement, and perhaps something about the power of bad is that there are two kinds of bad things that can happen. Yeah, and that applies to many things, even like your body temperature. It can be too high or too low, but you want it right at the right level. But the scientific community has been very comfortable and accepting of it. In terms of others, I think John might have more of a sense if others haven't.
Yeah. I guess the most common reaction I get is, oh, of course, that's why I obsess so much about the one negative comment on Facebook. And people sort of intuitively, once you point it out, seem to get it. As to how, I think the reactions, much of it tends to be on individual psychology. How risk averse are people? How much do they obsess on the negativity themselves? People do weight things and how much they try to weigh it. I mean, I see during this pandemic, I see young people who are at very little risk with this virus, walking through the woods by themselves with a mask. I see people driving alone in their cars with a mask. Those are people that have great loss aversion and, you know, sort of particular fears. On a group level, I mean, you know, there's a political.
John, can I ask you, and I don't want to get stuck on masks. I'm certainly not a physician or an epidemiologist, but is that, is it equally plausible that that's significant risk aversion, or it's an absence of skepticism? Like, people just aren't thinking. You know, they walk out the front door of the house, they put the mask on, and they don't think, I'm in my car that no one else enters, I'm by myself. It might be more than one effect there.
I guess, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a lack of critical thinking. I can see that. I mean, we talk in the book about safety addiction, which is that we think is the worst addiction of all. And we certainly see it now, that you get so addicted to safety, you end up doing things that, you know, that hurt you in the long run. And that's why people worry that the cure for this pandemic is worse than the disease. I mean, the examples are like after the terrorist attack of 9/11, people got so afraid of flying that they drove and more people died. And, you know, in the book, we talk about, you know, how football coaches are so afraid of failing on fourth down because they know they'll get a negative reaction, that they just keep punting and they lose games as a result of it. Golfers are the same way, where they're so afraid of making a bogey that they, you know, putt very conservatively, and it ends up costing, you know, the average pro golfer $600,000 a year because they're so afraid of bogeys. So I think we all have that to a certain extent, the safety addiction. I think some people are better at being able to, you know, to look rationally at risk. You know, people have different things they fear, so they're, you know, they're better able to do it. And there is something of a political divide on this too, I think. I mean, you know, libertarians tend to, you know, don't tell me what to do. I want to be able to make my own decisions. There are people who do it. You know, as we say in the book, this crisis, it's a bipartisan thing. I mean, you know, people on the right use fear, you know, that there's always, you know, the United States is the greatest military power in history, you know, unrivaled. And yet we've always got, you know, we've always had a crisis, so we have to build it up. We have to keep doing that. There's, you know, someone should worry about these tiny countries that supposedly threaten us. But I think it's more of a thing on the left because the, you know, basically people, progressives want to, you know, start new programs. They want to change society, you know, and the easiest way to do that is, you know, as Rahm Emanuel said, you never want to let a serious crisis go to waste. So, you know, as Lenin said, the worse, the better, is famous, you know. So, I mean, and I see some people kind of reveling almost in this pandemic is, oh, look at all these terrible problems. Look at all the work we're going to do. You know, look at all the government has to do now to, you know, to save us from this. So I think there is, in that sense, you know, the people on the left are more interested in seeing problems that need to be solved, and people on the right are more confident in let's let people try to solve this stuff more on their own.
You share in the book, you share the stories of about war and the fate of nations. I think that would be interesting for folks to think about this. I'm drawn to a lot of the stories about household management and dealing with your kids and your spouse and all of that. But there are some really interesting anecdotes that you shared about pre-World War I, the attitudes in Germany, all the way through to the build-up to the Gulf War for America. How does the power of bad affect military planners? And this, how does that play out where they're constantly you know, biasing behavior toward this buildup that you're talking about? Could you unpack that for folks?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about it, or do you want to talk about it?
You go ahead and go first.
Okay. A couple of social scientists, you know, read Roy's paper and were inspired to apply this lesson to history. And they went back and they looked at those wars you mentioned, that before World War I, Germany was the greatest military power, and, you know, economic and military power. It had no reason to fear its neighbors, no rational reason. But, you know, one of the German leaders was so convinced that the Russians were going to be invading them soon that he thought it wasn't worthwhile to plant trees at his country estate because the Russians will be here anyway. And the U.S. made the same mistake with Saddam's, you know, weapons of mass destruction. And that's a negativity bias. We overestimate the risk to us. We overestimate the threat from another country. And that gets paired with this other bias I mentioned, the optimism bias, in that we overestimate external threats, but we also overestimate our own capacities to do some things. Like, we all think we're better than average drivers. So we're we're safe on the road, even though we know that it's dangerous out there. So both Germany and the US, they overestimated the threat to themselves, and they also overestimated how easily they'd be able to deal with it. You know, we thought we'll install a stable democracy in Iraq, and the Germans expected a quick victory in the war. So that's how you end up blundering into these, you know, these disastrous wars. And of course, there's also the fact that politicians are always playing on those fears of people to, you know, I mean, it's one of the easiest ways to whip up fear is to have an external enemy. Do you want to say something, Roy? Or?
No, the Germany's invasion of Russia is sort of one of the most colossal military blunders of all time. And it has those two features. I mean, Hitler and Stalin had a truce, and the whole Eastern Front there could have been safe for Germany and could have concentrated on the Western war. But they thought, well, we're going to have to fight the Russians someday, and now is probably the best time because the Stalin's purges had killed a lot of the generals and officers and so on. So, and then they thought, well, even though we're going to be outnumbered, we can still probably beat them because we have better training and better equipment. And of course, there's a complete catastrophe, and you know, changed the world history. But that combination of overconfidence in their own powers and thinking, well, they needed to fight this war because it was going to happen sooner or later, which, you know, was not necessarily true at all.
I have another question here from the audience. Somebody's been watching Michael Moore's latest film that he posted on YouTube, where he digs into the environmental movement and subsidies and the total cost of things like solar energy, not just the perceived subsidized cost. And the question goes this way. With the abundance of doomsayers out there, it seems that there might be an opportunity for every piece of good news to be characterized in this sort of negative way, to feed into the hardwired bias, which is to say it's a disproof of the doomsayer. Rachel Carson had it wrong. We could be pointing that out more often. Do you see traction with this sort of approach, the negative approach to good news and pointing out where the doomsayers get it wrong? Or does that not work?
I think it can, and I think one example is that, you know, the urban legends, you know, about the Kentucky Fried Rat or about razor blades and apples used to be just commonly repeated in the media to scare everyone on Halloween to think of that. But that stopped because of sites like Snopes.com, which just started printing the facts. And so whenever a journalist would repeat one of these urban legends, there'd immediately be a slew of comments saying, no, this is a myth. And it embarrasses a journalist. It's a big negative thing to happen to get called out that way. So, and I kind of talk about having a crisis.com, or, you know, that would basically do this. I wish that there were more systematic attempts to keep track of doomsayers' records. I mean, it amazes me that you know, that anyone listens to Paul Ehrlich after the absurd predictions he made about the population crisis. You go back at all the, you know, it's so many environmental predictions that turned out wrong. I mean, one thing in this current pandemic, Robert Redfield, the head of the CDC, someone pointed out, it didn't get mentioned much, but back in the, you know, in the 80s and 90s, he had been one of the voices saying that the AIDS epidemic was going to be this great heterosexual epidemic too. You know, I mean, that was a huge, you know, scare back then. Life magazine had this big cover, "No one is safe," and everybody was promoting the idea that AIDS was going to spread across the entire population, even though there was reason to think no, that it wasn't. It was going to be. It was terrible, but it was confined to other groups. And I wish somebody had pointed that out when Redfield was kind of, you know, issuing his projections for this. That, you know, if people knew more about how wrong these prophets had been and pointed this out, I think it does help dissuade them. And I think that's one advantage of social media and the web, is that we do have all these other options and voices that can call people out. And that's a great service to point out how wrong they've been before. And, you know, what I love on, you know, every Earth Day that, you know, CEI and other groups will put out, just list the bad predictions that were made before. And it really, it puts things in perspective and makes you realize that these doomsaying things today are, you know, are being made by the same people who were so wrong before. And I think that is a way to use, you know, the negativity effect, to promote positive news. I mean, I have to confess that during this pandemic, I used the negativity effect on one of my hobby horses, which is the whole campaign for recycling and the whole war against plastic, which is completely irrational. I mean, as CEI and other groups have pointed out, plastic bags are better for the environment. Less impact on global warming, lots of other advantages to it. And yet there's been this kind of irrational fear of it. And this whole campaign to ban plastic bags was one of the more absurd things I've seen, that where you're actually hurting the environment by doing this. But when the pandemic came along and suddenly there was very good evidence that reusable bags actually can spread bacteria and viruses. There's lots of studies showing that. It wasn't fake, scaremongering, but that was an opportunity to use, negative stuff. That reusable bag could be spreading viruses in the supermarket, to remind people that, that there's an advantage to a new thin plastic bag. It doesn't spread germs, and it's got lots of other advantages.
This discussion of plastic bags, previously the CDC and bad predictions about epidemics, vaping comes to mind, which quickly, in policy circles, we talk about harm reduction. It's not safe or risk, it's safer. How do we choose a policy that makes people safer, given all the other alternatives and all the other variables? I wonder, and Roy, I ask you, thinking out loud here a little bit, you talk about how people can focus on a bad thing, the harm of, the potential harm of a vape, or the potential harm of a production and distribution and disposal of plastic. Are people better at that? Are we hardwired to think about one thing as opposed to make comparisons between alternatives? And is that something that feeds into this negativity bias, that if people were only better at comparing A and B and choosing a path, we might have less of this negativity bias?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. The overreaction, the hardwired, evolved innate property of the mind is to give more attention and do more processing on bad things than on good things. The corrective would be some of the things John has been mentioning, that you can stop, you can have your own inner mental red team to say, wait and look at the other side. I mean, I've been doing this my whole life. I realized when I was a boy that my parents could talk me into anything and make all sorts of outrageous things sound plausible. So I just trained myself. When somebody said something, I would stop and think of things from the opposite point of view and see if I could make the opposite case as well. And that's served me well. But that's something that people have to train themselves to do. So that's not a hardwired corrective. So what we're hoping to achieve in the book is, make people aware that the automatic response is to focus on the bad, overweight the bad, overrate it, worry too much about it. So, stop and discipline yourself and consider the other side. Many of these predicted crises, as John said, the leaders and governors are reacting to advisors based on the worst case scenarios. And well, the worst case scenario rarely turns out to be the actual case. It's just a possibility. So we're not using the powers of our mind, which are there, to do that correction. I mean, even today with the pandemic, the COVID thing, and it's certainly a serious problem, and people are dying and other people are getting very sick and recovering. And yet, almost for sure as well, we're overreacting, because that's just how the mind works. And to the extent we allow the worst case predictions to go, to be repeated uncritically and emphasized in the news media, then the politicians and the decision makers are swayed by those. And so it's going to quite possibly be another case where the solution is worse than the problem itself.
There's a real, You can do this at the personal level. And I mean, that was really our main hope from the book, that people can learn to think differently, you know, is that, you know, people go mad in crowds, but they regain their sanity one by one. A great quote from that old book, you know, the madness of crowds. There are such problems at the institutional level. You know, when I read an article about Bob Higgs lately, and his feeling is the only way to overcome this tendency to exploit crises to grow the government is to give the government less power. That there are such institutional, the negativity effect is so powerful in causing politicians to exploit crises, and it's so difficult to get rid of a program once it's there, because nobody wants to lose that program. There are special interests and bureaucrats who all profit from it, and they hate to lose it, and there isn't a sufficient force against it. You know, you mentioned the vaping thing, which has been one of, you know, my of all the idiocies that I have seen done, the vaping thing is, I mean, it is arguably the greatest public health advance since penicillin. I mean, it has caused, you know, smoking rates to plummet, you know, which is a leading preventable cause of death. And yet we have the FDA and the CDC have been actively, you know, spreading disinformation to scare people about vaping, so that most Americans now think that vaping is just as bad, if not worse, than smoking. I mean, that is a terrible, I mean, that is a, you know, that is, they're endangering the public health, the CDC and the FDA. And it's partly because, you know, and it's one reason, you know, that they're so bad at the current, you know, pandemic. They've been wasting their time on this kind of stuff instead of actually, the CDC is supposed to be dealing with infectious diseases, not vaping, not things like obesity. This is, you know, this is why they were created. And the institutional problems are, we talk in the book about that you get these coalitions of Baptists and bootleggers. You know, you get the company, you know, an industry that benefits from it, and you get sort of a nonprofit group that, you know, environmentalists and you know, and organic cotton growers get together to lobby for stuff. And you get it's a very difficult thing at the institutional level, because there's such pressure, you know, for those people to grow the government and exploit crises. So I mean, my main hope is at the individual level that people can stop being so easily swayed, and that we can then try to build in some of these safeguards to, you know, to prevent this stuff from going out of control. And the one encouraging thing I see in the pandemic is we've seen, you know, hundreds of regulations have been waived because people realize that these things were actually interfering with the pandemic. And it would be nice to, you know, I hope at least that some of those lessons will, you know, will follow through, that people have seen the bad effects of regulation, so maybe they can actually get rid of some of them.
Well, I think, John, you just made an advertisement for my colleague Michelle Mitten's work over the last 18 months. She's been writing extensively about the CDC and not only their misapplied focus, but their the pernicious effects of large nonprofits that are advocating for certain behaviors and messages out of the CDC in order to keep the scare going and not necessarily to improve public health. So thank you for that. I always will accept and welcome commercials for the good work of my colleagues at CEI.
CEI is just one of the leaders in this. You guys do great work. It really is impressive. I love Sam Kasman's work about the energy regulation, what they've done to dishwashers. It's all these little things, these regulations that end up, you know, and there's an organized interest in favor of it, you know, and the public is hurting, but they're not organized. And thank God you guys are speaking out.
Well, let me return the favor and make a very conscious and clear plug. I have here The Power of Bad. I want to encourage everyone not only to go out and buy a copy, but to buy two. If you follow the lessons of The Power of Bad, you might even buy four. The rule of thumb that Roy and John have for us is applied in different ways. 4 good things for every bad thing that comes through your media diet, comes through your life. We accept and encourage feedback. So I want to remind everyone in the audience that as we close down the program here, there will be a short survey available. I hope you'll fill that out. Help us frame these events in the future. Certainly, I am mindful of the lessons that you point out, that one bad comment can sting and sting disproportionately, but nonetheless, we need to hear those things from our audience and continue to improve what we're doing here. Roy and John, I want to thank you so much, not just for joining us, but for the work that you're doing. and the efforts that you're putting into spreading the word about this negativity bias so that people can better adapt and have strategies to deal with them. We will be back with another book event next week with a friend of yours, I know. Matt Ridley will be with us to discuss how innovation works and why it flourishes in freedom. That'll be on Tuesday, June 2nd. So come back, make sure to register and come back next Tuesday. And with that, I want to thank everyone involved and encourage you to not only look for the link to this book talk on YouTube, but to share and distribute it to your social networks, because this is a bit of good news that everybody could use. Thanks so much. That's all for today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kim.